Hello, welcome to the Persuasive Faith channel. My name is Rick Harvey, and I am the teacher of an adult class at Trinity Baptist Church in Norman, Oklahoma, in which we explore questions and objections which people might have as to the credibility of the Christian faith. We call it Persuasive Faith. This is a one-year-long class that we provide for the members of our church, and we are now in our 6th year of providing the class. Of course, normally we meet in a classroom setting, but due to the current coronavirus restrictions, we are now, at least temporarily we hope, meeting online, and we are using the Zoom format to facilitate that. Of course, the Zoom program makes it quite easy to make a video of the class, which we are doing, and then making that video available online to members of the class who may have missed a class or who wish to repeat some material, or to anyone else who might enjoy the class. I have edited the video down to include only the instructional portion of our time. Incidentally, we also have a website at persuasivefaith.org where you can access an audio podcast of all of our lessons throughout the year, as well as other things like class handouts and other resources. I hope you'll find this video informative and worthwhile, and if you do, don't hesitate to hit the like button so that other people on YouTube can know that there's material here that they might also find beneficial. So God bless, and here's today's video.
So we finished our module on history last week. We finished up talking about the Crusades and the wars of religion and witch hunts and that sort of thing. So we're moving on now to our lesson on our lessons on Jesus. So we'll have a module, I think it's about 4 lessons long, on the subject of Jesus. And so really this is all historical stuff too. And particularly today's lesson, we're going to talk about Jesus as a historical figure, a historical person. So in some ways, this is kind of a segue from our history module into the history of Jesus. So, and we have, I've got several resources for you there. Those first 2 books are written at the popular level. They're very easy to read. The Case for the Real Jesus by Strobel and Craig's On Guard. Richard Baucham's is also, it's much more substantial. It is fairly academic work, but it's pretty easy to read. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, but it's a tremendous piece of research and study. And then at a more advanced level, Craig's Reasonable Faith, I've talked about several times before. He has a section on, of course, on Jesus. And Michael Lacona's The Resurrection of Jesus, a book we'll talk about more when we get into our study of the resurrection. But he has a great section on history and how you do history and how we can know that Jesus really was a historical figure and the things that we know about him. So when you start to talk to people about Jesus, you're likely to run into a variety of questions. And so I've just listed several of them there, that questions that actually do come up. And oftentimes people do really wonder whether or not Jesus that we read about in the Gospels was a real person. Did such a person ever really exist, or is he just kind of a fiction made up by people, or is he a myth that we borrowed, that Christianity borrowed from somebody else? Or and then even if they're ready to acknowledge that Jesus existed, there's all that stuff about miracles and exorcisms and all that stuff in the Gospels. And, do we really believe that? And why should we believe that? And then there are people who will acknowledge that Jesus was a real person, that he was a good teacher and all that sort of thing. But as they read the Gospels, they claim that they don't see him making claims, messianic claims that he was the Messiah, or divine claims that he is God. Those actually are 2 different things, by the way. But they say, we just don't see that in the Gospel. So did he really claim those things? And then a real issue with many people, particularly with Muslims, was Jesus even crucified? Or even, in fact, with Muslims, did he even die? So the question comes up about, was Jesus executed by the hands of Pontius Pilate, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there are all the questions about his resurrection. And, of course, this last question is a question we'll deal with in our final module on the resurrection that we'll get to in a few weeks. So, but just kind of imagine a situation where maybe somebody comes to you, maybe one of your children or your grandchildren comes to you, they come home from school, or they come home from college or whatever, and they start telling you about the Mithras myth, or one of the other myths of the ancient or Greco-Roman world. So, for example, they might bring up the god Mithras, and they'll talk about the fact that in the Mithras religion, Mithraism, Mithras was born of a virgin in a cave. He was considered to be a great itinerant teacher. He had 12 disciples. He promised his followers immortality. He sacrificed himself for world peace. He was buried in a tomb and rose 3 days later. He instituted a Eucharist, or a Lord's Supper. He was considered by the followers of Mithras to be the Logos, the Redeemer, the Messiah. Now, if somebody says that to you when you're talking to them about Jesus, what do they say? If they bring up the story of Mithras, what do they say? Okay, that obviously, the whole Jesus thing is just a myth, and it's probably borrowed from Mithraism and all that sort of thing. Okay, so these are some of the things that we run into when we talk to people about Jesus, right? Well, we'll come back to all of this in a few minutes. All right. So, one of the questions that I think we should consider is, and encourage people to think about, when they approach the New Testament, particularly now in these lessons, we're talking primarily about the Gospels, okay? And those things in the epistles that talk specifically about the life of Jesus. So we're talking primarily about the Gospels. And the question is, when people approach the Gospels, what kind of frame of mind is most reasonable to have? Should people approach the Gospels, the particular stories about Jesus, various stories, and what they call periocopes, the individual stories in the Gospels, should they approach it with a kind of a presumption of skepticism? Okay, I'm not going to believe it unless I have some kind of overwhelming reason to believe it. So just kind of generally a skeptical view. Or should they approach it with more kind of a neutral position? Okay, well, I don't know if it's true or not, so I'm just going to read it and see what happens. Okay, or is it more reasonable to approach the gospel, and particularly the stories of Jesus, is it more reasonable to approach them with an assumption or just a basic disposition that they're true? Okay, and I want to stress here, I'm not talking about infallibility or inerrancy. Well, those are things that as Christians we hold to. At least most Christians hold to one or other of those positions: infallibility and or inerrancy. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about a general assumption that most of what we read in the Gospels is true. Is that a reasonable way to approach the New Testament? And one way to think about this for us would be, in one respect, is just to remember the things we talked about in our authority module. So we spent several weeks talking about the Bible and the credibility of the Bible. So just keep in mind some of the things, particularly when you're talking to people about Jesus and the truthfulness of the gospel accords. Keep in mind some of the things we've talked about when we talked about the reliability of Scripture. Okay, so one of the things we established is that we can have great confidence in the text we possess, that the text is an accurate representation of what was originally written, and we can have a good deal of confidence in the content, at least the historical content of the New Testament. And we also have reasons to have great confidence in the specific Gospels that we possess, the specific canon that we possess. These are all things we talked about at length. Okay, we talked about the archaeological evidence and the extra-biblical evidence that support the historicity of the Gospel accounts. And we also talked about the contrast between the genre of the Gospels, the style of literature that the Gospels are, and the a style of literature that the myths are. And we talked about that radical contrast between the genre of myth and the genre of Greco-Roman bio, which is the category which the Gospels fall into. And then we also talked about the three different quests for the historical Jesus. In particular, I called your attention at the time to the third quest for the historical Jesus, which is sometimes called the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. Okay. And you remember that that the Jewish reclamation of Jesus, or the third quest, is really a project or phenomena that occurs with Jewish scholars. So these are not Jews who are Christians. These are actually Jewish scholars who are of the Jewish faith, but who are, of course, as scholars, experts in this period of time that we're talking about. So these are scholars who study the Gospels from a Jewish perspective. All right, and the thing that these scholars are arguing is that Jesus was a real first-century person, that he exhibited the characteristics of a first-century Jewish rabbi, both in the way he taught, the style, the techniques he used in his teaching, with his parables and his mnemonic aids and things like that. So in the style of teaching, he exhibits the characteristics of a first-century Palestinian Jewish rabbi, and also in much of the content, many of the things that he teaches, he exhibits those characteristics. And they even acknowledge that he made messianic claims. So whether they believe his messianic claims or not, they do recognize that the things Jesus said did constitute messianic claims. So these are some of the things we've already covered in considerable depth. So just keep those in mind. So given those things, I would argue that a skeptical approach to the New Testament is unwarranted. And I would say even a neutral approach is really unwarranted, and for several reasons. One is that we know now that the New Testament was written before there was sufficient time to erase the memory of what happened. So the argument for many years with scholars was there was this gap of time between the life of Jesus and when this stuff was really written down. And so the real history of Jesus got lost, and what we read in the Gospels was constructed later to make Jesus into this character that we as Christians worship. But there just wasn't enough time, okay, between the writing of the Gospels and the actual events for that to happen. The genre of the Gospels, as I've already mentioned, is markedly different from that of myths, okay? In addition, we know that the Jews had methods both in their oral transmission of their history and in their written transmission of their history. They had mechanisms in place, they had methods in place to protect their history, to make sure that their history was preserved. And of course, a lot of this we've already talked about, and just some of this is just reviewed. In addition to that, the early church also had safeguards for the preservation of the history. Okay, so for example, one of the safeguards, just institutionally speaking, is that the New Testament itself was written during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So again, there's not that time for myth to develop or for legends to develop, that sort of thing. And the second thing is that is related to the first, is that the New Testament was written during the lifetime of the apostles themselves. And you have the institution by Jesus of apostolic authority. What was that? What was it?
Ben.
Oh, I got a message. Okay. Well, I should have turned off notifications.
Happy Father's Day, love Ben.
So at any rate, that you have the institution of apostolic authority. So that the things that were written, that were embraced by the church, did so with the imprimatur of the apostolic recognition and approval. Okay, so these are just some of the reasons. Also, we know, as I've mentioned, that when we compare the New Testament against extra biblical sources and archaeology and that sort of thing, that the New Testament just has a tremendous track record for historical reliability. And this is why I argue that a skeptical approach to the Gospels is just simply unwarranted. There's just too much evidence of their credibility and too much reason to believe in their credibility. And as I said, I would even argue that I don't think a neutral approach is really called for. I think we can approach the New Testament documents, and again, not even insisting on infallibility or inerrancy, but we can just approach them with this general sense that the Gospels are just good quality, reliable history. Okay, and I make that point because I want us to understand that even as Christians, we believe that the doctrine of the infallibility of Scripture is very important, and many Christians, myself included, believe very strongly in the inerrancy of Scripture, and that's incredibly important, and that's something we shouldn't compromise on. But we need to keep in mind when we're talking to unbelievers, when we're talking to people, for example, who are coming to the Bible for the first time, they don't have to believe in the infallibility of Scripture. They don't have to believe in inerrancy to learn these things about Jesus and have confidence in the character and the teachings and the claims and the life and death and resurrection of Christ. They can do that without making a commitment to the doctrine of infallibility. So what I'm saying is, you don't have to believe in the infallibility of Scripture to get saved. Okay? And we need to keep that in mind and not ask people to make a commitment further than they're ready to make if that's not necessary for them. So that's just the point I'm trying to make there. So when scholars approach ancient documents, in particular, we're talking here about the New Testament and particularly about the Gospels, when they approach those, even if you approach it with a disposition of confidence that they are reliable, basically that they're true, historians notice certain things in the text that just kind of jump out to them and give them even greater confidence in the credibility of the text. Okay, and you can call those things historical authenticity markers. Scholars typically refer to them as the criteria of authenticity. Okay, so these are things that scholars and historians notice in an ancient text, and particularly the ones I'm going to mention are ones that relate to the Gospels. Things they see in the text that jump out to them and give them confidence or added confidence in the credibility of, say, the particular story that they're reading in the Gospels about Jesus doing something or a particular teaching of Jesus. So again, I'm not talking about the Gospels as a whole, but I'm talking about the individual pericopes and stories and teachings in the New Testament. So scholars look for these authenticity markers or criteria of authenticity because they help validate the credibility of a text. And we talked about these criteria of authenticity. We talked about them a little bit in our module on authority, but I want to explore them a little bit more today. And one of the things we talked about is that these markers are sufficient but not necessary test of authenticity. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Well, when we say they're sufficient, what we mean is that when you detect one of these markers in the text, just its existence in the text is sufficient in and of itself to bolster your confidence in the text. So you may have generally believed this is probably true, but you see one of these markers and you go, oh, I see. Okay, I have even more confidence now in the truthfulness of this particular account or this particular story. But they are not necessary. Okay, so I can have a general confidence in the reliability of the text even if none of these markers are present. Okay. So I could have none of these markers, but still, because I have a general confidence in the reliability of Scripture and I've seen its reliability in other areas, I could have confidence in a particular story just because I know, generally speaking, the New Testament is true, even if I don't see one of these markers. All right? So when scholars employ these markers, along with everything else they know from archaeology and everything else they know. The majority of contemporary Jesus scholars and historians of this Greco-Roman era of the 1st century or so, the majority of those scholars now express a great deal of confidence in the overall historicity and reliability of the New Testament and of the Gospels. Okay. So that's kind of where historians are. So what are these authenticity markers? There are 5, actually people group them differently and list different ones, but primarily there are 5. And the first one is historical fit. So you're reading something in the Gospels and you notice how this incident fits very well with things we know about that time. Okay? So if you see something that fits well historically, that gives you greater confidence in the story. The second thing is independent early sources. So we talked about how the gospel writers relied upon different sources as they compiled their gospels under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And so as scholars of the New Testament, we read the Gospels and basically we see 4 sources. We see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But New Testament scholars, when they read Matthew, they'll detect possibly a couple different sources in Matthew that Matthew used. We know Luke, for example, used different sources. He says so explicitly in his writing. So scholars are able, they believe, to detect some of these different sources. So we actually have more than just these 4 sources. There are actually a number of different sources. So, when they're reading something in the Gospels and they know that they come from different sources, like this story we know came from, say, for example, Mark and John, and that's 2 different sources or independent sources. So we as Christians, we kind of we lump the whole New Testament together and think of it as one source. But actually it's a combination of sources. And the more independent sources you have, the more witnesses you have to an event, the more credible it seems. The third criteria is embarrassment. So stories that are included in the New Testament that somebody writing fiction probably wouldn't have included, if he was interested in the development of the church. So, for example, the story of Peter's betrayal. That's not a story that a fiction writer, writing, Peter's already the head of the church, he's the leader of the church, or one of the primary leaders of the church. It's unlikely that an early Christian writing a fictional account would have made that story up. Okay? So it contains the elements of what we call embarrassment. And then there's the element of dissimilarity. Okay? And this is a situation where you encounter something, say, for example, in the teaching of Jesus, that obviously could not have grown out of Jewish thinking, or could not have typical Jewish thinking the way Jews typically thought. So a classic example of this, and we'll talk about this in our module on resurrection, is the story of the resurrection itself. Okay, when we look at that, we're going to see that it's just virtually impossible that story of a physical resurrection could have grown either out of Jewish thinking at the time or pagan thinking at the time. Okay, so this would be a case of dissimilarity. This is so different from the way people typically thought at times. It's unlikely that somebody writing fiction would have made this up. It probably happened. And then another element which most of us can't pick up on because we're not Aramaic scholars or Hebrew scholars or whatever, are what they call Semitism. So the New Testament, of course, is the text we have now is primarily written in Greek. Okay, but in reading Greek, the scholars, the linguists who know this stuff, they'll pick up in the Greek flavors of Hebrewisms or Aramaic, flavors of the Aramaic language, and they'll pick that up. And that's indicative of somebody who is just telling the true story the way it is, and not somebody who only knew Greek writing fiction. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I know you say they don't have to have these to prove it, which makes sense, but like number one, the historical fit. I mean, like in the Book of Mormon, there are lots of anachronistic things that are the opposite and don't fit it. So if the absence of them is one thing, but when it actually, there are things in it that don't fit the time, does that?
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah, that would be a reason to question me. Yeah, absolutely, very good point, sure, okay. And then the sixth thing is coherence, and that is, does the story fit with other things we know about Jesus? So, for example, you may not have any of these other criteria, okay, but you know that the story you're reading fits with other things we know about Jesus that are well supported. Then you go, well, this is probably true too, because we know these other things that are well supported are true. Okay, so these are some of the markers that scholars see, and they go, aha, this helps us validate the truthfulness of this particular story or this particular account. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's this idea that's really quite common in the popular culture today that Jesus is a copycat. Okay, that Christianity in its early years just borrowed its primary beliefs about Jesus from these other religions that were prevalent at the time. So the claim is made that there are a number of these mystery religions and pagan religions that were in the Greco-Roman world at the time that have stories of dying and rising gods. Okay, that they have stories of virgin births and other key events in the life of Jesus, like his disciples and things like that. Okay, and so the argument is, since all these other religions have these things, Christianity is just borrowing from these other religions and constructing its own mythology using these other religions. Now, of course, we're going to deal with specifically the claim of dying and rising gods in our module on the resurrection. But the question is, how do historical scholars, how do they view this hypothesis that Christianity was borrowed from these neighboring pagan religions? And actually, this view was quite common with scholars from about the end of the 19th century and up through about the middle of the 20th century. There are a lot of scholars who claim that, all right? But modern scholarship today is pretty much rejected it. So you get a few scholars here and there. There's always the exception that proves the rule, of course. But most New Testament scholars, whether they're Christians or atheists or whatever they are, most New Testament scholars today reject this whole idea. And the question is, why do they reject it? Okay? And there are about 7 or 8 different reasons why they reject this borrowing myth. And the first one is, it's just a logically incoherent argument. So it's a logical fallacy to claim that if two things are similar, one grew out of the other, right? Or one caused the other. So if I have sitting in my driveway, which I don't, by the way, a Lexus and a golf cart, okay, they're similar, right? They have, they have steering wheels and 4 wheels and a transmission and some, kind of engine or motor or whatever, So we could say they're similar. Therefore, the Lexus grew out of the polycar, or not the polycar, the golf cart. Maybe the polycar.
Totally destroyed my image.
So obviously that's a logical fallacy, right? And scholars recognize that now, that you just can't claim that because two things are similar, one grew out of the other. Incidentally, that same fallacy comes up in biology, right, with the theory of evolution. Two things are similar, one grew out of the other. That's a logical fallacy. Unless, of course, you have some kind of evidence that, in fact, one did, which, of course, you might in some cases. The second problem is, in most cases, the chronology is wrong. Christianity predates most of these mystery religions by 100 to 300 years. So it's highly unlikely that Christianity grew out of something that came after it, right?
Could it be that grew out of Christianity?
There is some indication or a possibility that some of those things were picked up, but scholars don't tie them closely together simply because they don't have the evidence. Okay? The third point is that we know that Paul was a Jew, and he was in fact a Pharisee before he became a Christian, right? And so we know that he would have considered any kind of borrowing from pagan religions. That would have just been anathema to Paul, who of course was the primary person in the shaping of early Christianity. In addition to that, we know that the early Christians were highly exclusivistic, as conservative Christians are today. We're very exclusivistic. We're very careful about our doctrine and how much our doctrine is influenced by outside factors, right? And the early church was that way. And in fact, thousands of early Christians died in order to resist the syncretism of paganism with Christianity. Okay? So it's highly unlikely that the early church would have incorporated other religions. And then the fifth point is that most of the similarities that you hear brought up, and I brought up earlier, most of those similarities are either exaggerated, they're outright fabricated, or they're irrelevant or insignificant. Okay, so let's take, for example, on that point 5, let's take, for example, the Mithraism myth. Okay, so the claim is that he was born of a virgin. Well, actually, the scholars of Mithraism who studied it tell us, well, no, that's not true. In the first place, he was a god, he wasn't a man, so he wasn't born in the sense of a human being being born. The second thing was he emerged from a stone fully developed.
But that stone was a virgin.
So there's just no similarity between the emergence of Mithras and the virgin birth of Jesus. Was he born in a cave? Well, actually, there's really no story about him being born, of course, in that sense. But even if he were born in a cave, that's irrelevant. The New Testament doesn't tell us where Jesus was born. We know he was placed in a manger, but we don't even know that he was born in a stable. We think that because of the manger, but the New Testament really doesn't tell us. I actually don't believe he was born in a stable, but that's another issue altogether. Did he sacrifice himself for world peace? That's the claim that's made. Well, no, he didn't sacrifice it. There is a story of him sacrificing a bull, okay? But this whole idea of world peace, that's a Christian concept, right? That's not something that pagan mythology thought about, world peace. So that idea is foreign to pagan mythology, and it's read back into pagan mythology from Christianity. So it's a little bit of what you were just bringing up there, Steve. Was he a great itinerant teacher with 12 followers? Well, no, he was a god, he wasn't a man. So he didn't travel around teaching, all right? He didn't have 12 disciples. There's nothing in the mythology about that. That's things that people literally are fabricating in order to claim that Christianity grew out of Mithraism. Did he promise immortality? So what? Almost all religions promise some form of immortality. So that's really insignificant. Was he buried in a tomb and raised 3 days later? Well, actually, there's in the Mithras myth, there's no discussion of his death. So there's obviously not any reference of his resurrection or rising again. All right. Did he institute a Eucharist or a Lord's Supper? And here again, this is just insignificant. Almost all religions have some kind of holy meal of some sort. That's just a common feature of many religions. So if you see it with some of the pagan religions, it's really irrelevant. And the second thing is, we know where we get the Eucharist. We know where we get the Lord's Supper, right? We know it didn't come from pagan mythology. We know it comes from the Passover. We know it doesn't have an origin in mythology. It has an origin in a historical meal that the Jews engaged in. We know that's the origin of it. Was he considered the Logos, the Redeemer, the Messiah, that sort of thing? Of course, the Messiah, the idea of Messiah is what? It's a Jewish concept, isn't it? There's no idea of messiahs in mythology, in pagan mythology. These are all ideas that people are reading Mithraism, and then they're reading these theologies back into the mythology from Christianity. So they're bringing their concepts from Christianity and reading it back into paganism. So, and then again, Mithraism particularly is actually it's a 2nd century phenomenon. So it develops, it actually has roots back into ancient Persia, but it doesn't really come to the Greco-Roman world. It comes primarily through Roman military, through Roman soldiers. It doesn't really appear in the Greco-Roman world until the 2nd century. So again, you have this problem that Christianity comes first. And so people do raise the question that you raised, Steve. So maybe some of these similarities are just cases where people are borrowing from Christianity rather than the other way around, although that's not been established historically, okay? That was all on the fifth point. The sixth point is that Christianity is rooted in history. All of Christianity's teachings are rooted in historical events and historical claims. That's in stark contrast to mythology. So you get references to specific historical people, specific historical events, specific historical events. That's the basis of Christianity. So even if there are some points of similarity between Christianity and some of these pagan religions, and I've mentioned 2 or 3 where there might be some similarity, even if they are, that doesn't negate the fact that all of the teachings about Jesus are historically rooted. They're not rooted in mythology. They have a historical basis. And then there is the possibility that the parallels that do exist could be the other way around. It could be Christianity influencing these other religions. And then the 8th point is there is nothing, and we'll talk about this when we get to the dying and rising God things in the resurrection module. But there is nothing like the resurrection, either in Jewish thinking or in pagan mythology. Okay, so those are all reasons why scholars today pretty much reject this whole borrowed myth. Now, in the time we have left, I'd like to talk about 2 fairly recent developments in biblical scholarship that I just find fun. Okay, these are really cool, and they both happen to be related to the subject of names in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, for that matter. And the first one has to do with why some particular people are named when we wouldn't expect them to be named. Okay, and the second one was what we can learn from the frequency of names as they occur in the Gospels and Acts. And there's been some really cool scholarship that's been done on this in the last 20 years or so. And so on the first point, why are certain people named? And for this, I mentioned Richard Balkin's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and so he's kind of a leading thinker in this area. And when you think about it, in the Gospels, you encounter kind of 2 groups of people, right? So the first group of people would be people that you would expect to be identified by name. So these would be important characters in the story. So, for example, the disciples of Jesus, we see their names, we would expect to see their names. They play a very important role in the story. The important women, like when you get to the story of the account of Easter Sunday, and a number of women get mentioned, okay? And their specific names get mentioned because they're playing a very important role in the Christian story, right? And then there are public figures, historical figures, Pilate, Caiaphas, Herod, these various very significant historical figures. You expect them to be named, right? And then Old Testament figures and the genealogies. You know, if you're given a genealogy, you got to give names, right? So there are these various individuals who you would expect to be named, and they are named in the Gospels, right? But the second group, okay, these are kind of lesser characters. Now, they're not less significant to God or to Jesus, okay? But as far as the story is concerned, they play a smaller role. They're lesser characters in the story, okay? And in many cases, this would be somebody who Jesus only encounters one time. There's no further encounter with them. There's no further interaction with them, okay? So an example would be the demoniac there in Luke chapter 8. Okay, so Jesus, encounters a demoniac, calls him a demoniac, but we don't know who he is. We don't have his name, right? That little boy who had the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, that's what, 5 loaves and 2 fishes, right? You know, wouldn't you love to know his name was Billy? But we don't know. It just calls him a lad. Okay? So these would be people who are, in one sense, lesser characters, right? And so most of the cases where Jesus heals someone and there's no further interaction or whatever, there's no more mention of it. We don't get the name, right? So as it turns out, in reading the Gospels, the vast majority of people who fit in group 2 remain unnamed. And in fact, Bachman says this. He says the material common to the 3 synoptic Gospels, he's focusing primarily on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he says. The material common to the 3 synoptic Gospels, therefore, shows an unambiguous tendency towards the elimination of names. He's saying that when you read particularly the synoptic Gospels, it's noticeable that they're eliminating names that they don't need. They're trying to keep the story moving forward, the narrative moving forward, and not bog it down with a bunch of individual names. And he says that's characteristic of the Gospel writers. But what's interesting then is that with the Gospel writers, of people who fit into that second group, okay, that you do on occasion get names specifically mentioned. So, for example, Bartimaeus. Okay, now how many blind people did Jesus heal? And we hear about him healing a lot of blind people. But with one in particular, he mentions his name, blind Bartimaeus, right? Or Jairus. Remember Jairus? God didn't even heal Jairus. He healed his daughter, right? But he mentions Jairus, right? Simon the leper, Malchus, okay? So these are names that you wouldn't expect to get mentioned. And a particularly interesting case is Simon of Cyrene. Who was he? He carried the cross, right? So he's kind of between 1 and 2. You know, you could kind of see. But you know what's fascinating? Mark doesn't just tell us about Simon of Cyrene. He tells us the names of his sons. Now, isn't that curious?
Like, did he know him? Or did he have to go ask that question?
Isn't that fascinating? So, for example, Rufus and Alexander are the sons of Simon of Cyrene. Okay? And Mark tells us that in the story of the crucifixion. Okay? But when we get to Romans chapter 16, Paul greets a man in Rome named Rufus and Rufus's mother. And most scholars, when they look at that, they go, oh, that's Rufus, the son of Simon of Cyrene, and his mother is Simon's wife. And most scholars acknowledge that. Why is that significant? That means that there was a woman and a man in the church in Rome. The man could attest to his father's experience at the crucifixion, and the woman could attest to her husband's experience at the crucifixion. Okay? It's just a fascinating story, right? So Baucham's argument is that in this second group, when you have these just handful of names in the second group that are mentioned, it's because people know who those people are. It's because the recipients of the Gospels knew these names. They knew who Bartimaeus was. They knew who Jairus was. Very possibly because these people were in the church, possibly even well known in the church. Okay? So it's very likely then, according to Bauckham, that the individuals who were named, but otherwise would not have been named, were known, possibly well known to the church, and they would have been able to give eyewitness testimony to the specific story in which they are included. So it's just a very cool discovery that has come to light just in the last 10 or 20 years or so. I think of these last couple of discoveries as kind of Easter eggs. You know, and people who write computer code and stuff, they sometimes include what they call Easter eggs. And they write these little kind of cute little things into the code that only other code writers would go, oh, that's cool, you know, and it's a reference to their daughter's birthday or something, and it's written in the code. They're called Easter eggs because most people don't see them, but somebody finds them. Okay, and it's kind of like God incorporated in the Gospels these Easter eggs that don't get discovered for 2,000 years, and now we see them, and they lend and added credibility. The second one has to do, and this is really fun to me, is the frequency of names in the Gospels. So you have this Jewish scholar, a woman, who in 2002 published a database that listed every single Jewish name in Palestine over 500 period from 330 BC to 200 AD.
She was on record.
She must have been on some, yeah. Obsessive compulsive, you know, one of those things. So she went through and she consulted things like, of course, the New Testament. So she used the Gospels, she used Josephus' writings, she looked at the Masada records, she looked at the records from the ossuaries, you know, those boxes that they buried people's bones in, and the inscription. So she looked at every known source of names for that 500-year period. Okay? And then she compiled a database of it. So what that means is that now, as of just 20 years ago, it's now possible, for the first time in history, it's now possible for us to know the relevant popularity of every name in first century Palestine. So, for example, you know, I was born, I won't say how long ago, but when I was born, Richard was a fairly common name. So I know a number of guys about my age. I have a brother-in-law who's named Richard. I'm Richard. You know, we have a guy teaching another class here at Trinity. His name is Richard, goes by Rick, you know. I know 6 or 8 different Richards or Ricks or Dicks, okay? If you go down a generation or two, Christopher seems to be a very common name, right? So how many people can you think of here at Trinity named Chris? You know, I know, not just here at church, but I know, we have 2 on staff here at church. But aside from that, I know about, you know, half a dozen or more different Chris's. You know, one of them's living next door to me, okay? The point I'm trying to make is that for different periods of time in history, you have different names that are more popular than others, right? Now, for the first time in history, we can go back to first century Palestine and ask us, which were the names in first century Palestine that were the most popular, and second most popular, and third most popular, and that research has been done. Okay. So, for example, we know that the name Simon or Simeon was the most common name in first century Palestine. It's interesting that in the New Testament there are 8 different Simons or Simeons. Similarly, on the female side, Mary is the most common name, right? And I forget how many there are on the New Testament. It's like 5 or 6 Marys just in the New Testament itself, right? And actually, as it turns out, as you read the New Testament and do all this math, okay, with these various names, it turns out that the breakdown in the New Testament, particularly, we're talking the Gospels and Acts. So as you break down the frequency of the occurrence of these various names, both on the male side and the female side, the breakdown in the New Testament parallels almost precisely the breakdown from this database of first century names. Okay, so what's the significance of that? Well, so we have this comparative popularity of names now that we've weighed out and we've compared them. But think about this. If somebody was constructing a fictional account, so the Gospels are really essentially fictional. So you've got a fictional person, whether they live in Palestine or maybe they're not even, you know, maybe they're a Greek living in Rome or somewhere and they're writing this story. How do they get this information right? There is no way someone living in the first century could have known this. In other words, I know that the name Richard was a common name about the time, you know, in those decades around when I was born, and I know that Christopher is common name in a subsequent generation, right? But I would have no idea, given a snapshot of 21st century America, I would have no idea whether Richard or Christopher is most popular. So if I were writing a novel in which I had all kinds of characters playing a role, how would I, just writing fiction, get just the right, first place, I probably would never put two characters with the same name, because that would confuse my readers, right? Do you ever notice how confused you get in the Gospels when you read about all these Simons or all these Marys? You know, how many Marys do you read about in the resurrection account alone, okay? So, as a fictional writer, I would not be inclined to duplicate names. I certainly would not have the resources, unless I was an extremely sophisticated researcher in the 21st century. I would have no way of knowing that I should include this percentage of Richards and this percentage of Christophers and this percentage of Steves and this percentage of, you know, Georges or whatever. I would have no way of knowing that. And so the point of this research is that this just seems to tell us that whoever wrote this was writing history. They were telling true stories. They were talking about true people just as the story unfolded. Okay? So those are just a couple aspects of just fairly recent research that I just think are really, so I like to talk about. You know. So all that being said, just in conclusion, a couple things. One, the claim that Christianity copied its accounts from other myths, okay, we see that that's just totally incredible. So if somebody comes to you and they tell you that, you know, you have some answers you can give to them. You know, scholars don't believe that anymore. This is why they don't believe that sort of thing. But we can go much further than that. We have great confidence in the historical reliability of the accounts of Jesus. And again, when I'm talking to somebody who's not a Christian or whatever, you know, I don't have to harp on the infallibility and the inerrancy of Scripture. I believe that, and I believe those things are important, and I believe the Scriptures are completely and perfectly true. But I don't even have to go that far with somebody. I just have to show them that they can have confidence that these things really happened historically. So Jesus really was a man who lived in first century Palestine. We know that he did the things that are historically recorded for us in the Gospels, that he went about teaching. We know the kinds of things he taught. We know about his miracles and that sort of thing. We know about the claims that he made about himself, and that's what we're going to focus on next week. Did Jesus really claim to be the Messiah, and did he claim to be divine? And so we'll look at that in close course. We'll be looking at a number of specific scriptures on that. And we know, too, that the records regarding his faith, his death, his crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and his resurrection, we know that these are highly credible historical sources and records. So these are just some of the things that can give us tremendous confidence when we think about Jesus as he fits in history. Okay? So next week, the question is, who is Jesus? And once we see what Jesus claimed to be, then we're going to ask the question the following week, why should we believe him? Okay? So that's kind of where we're going next couple of weeks.